Adams are going to talk a little bit about the Civil War in a little series that we're going to put together on video. Tonight we're going to talk about things that led up to the Civil War. I'm going to talk about the Confederate perspective, and Alex is going to talk about the Northern perspective, and then we're going to talk a little bit about trying to resupply Fort Sumter in the very first start of the war. When the Founding Fathers founded our country, they left open the debate about slavery. And of course, the Civil War is not totally based on slavery. It's really based upon power. And when our country was first started, there was, of course, 13 states. And there was a provision put in the Constitution that new territories could ask for permission to join the Union. And in a short time, as the government acquired property and had property of its own, there were more states that came into the Union. Well, it kind of set off a little bit of a problem in that southern states were coming on board, and the southern states, of course, were slave-holding states. And so the northerners felt like there needed to be states up north that had no slaves. So when the Northwest territories, what we would call Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, those states like that came into being, there was not a whole lot of fight from the South about slaves in those states. They felt like those states would not really have a lot of slave type labor anyway, but they also felt like they didn't want to open it up to slavery because it would be such a fight with them because of the cheap labor that would be up there. So they said, okay, you want to be free states, you can be free states. Well, then we had the Louisiana Territory Purchase, which brought in a whole lot of land into our country. And, the southern part of that territory, most certainly the slave people thought, wow, we could have slaves there. But also more states, even if they weren't slaves, that would support our side. They would be kindred spirits with us. So as time went on, they tried to work out a system where if a slave state came in, a free state came in. And finally, they couldn't really agree on it anymore till we had the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise was an agreement between North and South whereby they marked a line at the southern end of Missouri and said, we're going to draw this west all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and states that would come in, territories that would organize and become states, below that line would be slave, those north of it would be free state. Well, there's a little problem that developed with that whenever Texas joined the Union. There was the Mexican War. There was issues with when Texas was annexed, whether the lands that Texas claimed that were not in Texas proper would be slave or not. They worked that out to where that they probably weren't going to be, and what Texas did was they joined the Union, and the Union absorbed the debt of Texas, and Texas gave up claims to these other lands that it had. And that worked for a while, and then they came to the idea of Kansas and Nebraska. These were territories that wanted to become states, and they're trying to organize them. And the question was, are they going to be free or are they going to be slaves? The Southerners thought this is really going to throw off the balance of power if both of these become free states. So it was leading to a fight, and the fight again is about power. It's not totally over slavery. Slavery's kind of in the background, but the idea is power. I didn't talk about, too, there was a tariff, I think it's a tariff of 1828, and the tariff of 1828 put a high tariff on things that were coming in from Great Britain, and the South really thought that that was an unfair business advantage to the North to their detriment. And so we had these hard feelings about we got to have power, we got to have it equally, we're not getting dealt with correctly on trade in the country, we're getting the bad end of this, we're having to purchase things that are a lot higher priced from the North than they're getting our stuff from the South. And so this led up to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and really it was kind of the idea of Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the idea of popular sovereignty, that when these territories came in, it would be up to them to decide whether they would be free or slave. And he was able to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed with the help of the South, which allowed territory that, due to the Missouri Compromise, probably wouldn't have been slave at all. They were going to leave it up to the people to make that determination. And also, there was the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed the South to be able to retrieve slaves that had gone north when there was a question about that. And so we're coming to a situation where, you know, there's bloody Kansas. People are fighting over trying to get people in there to make sure it goes slave, others wanting it to go free. And we come up to the time we're getting close to 1860. We have John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry. At that time, Virginia. And his raid was unsuccessful, but people in the South were shocked that so many people in the North felt like he was a martyr. And anytime slave rebellion, even the idea that really scared the South because of the large number of slaves that were there. And so that happened. There was also the writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this is a very popular book in the North. Harriet Beecher Stowe probably was not a realistic idea of what happened on plantations in the South. I think there was some accusations she'd never even been in the South or had hardly ever been there. And so the Southerners were really upset at how it portrayed them as acting. And so there was a lot of tension going on. And at the basis of all this was power, was slavery, was the idea of sectionalism, the idea that my part of the country is different, and then because of that difference it's somehow better, or we've got it right here, you don't have it right there. And also the idea of the South feeling neglected or put down because of the tariff that was in place, all led to some general feelings that we just can't work this out. The idea of nullification started, where the idea of we don't like this federal law, that we're going to just say that we don't accept that federal law in our state. That was a big feeling in the South because politically they were losing the power because there were more states and more populous states coming in as free than as slave. And so the South felt like that over time they were just going to become second-class citizens. And they were doing everything they could to fight that. They had a particular way of life that they wanted to live, and they essentially wanted to be left alone. And they honestly felt that their states had a right to leave the Union because the Constitution said they could. And they felt that if worse come to worse, that the Union of the United States of America was just a compact between states, and if the states no longer wanted to be in that union, then they had the right to leave it. And of course they understood that that would be a very emotional thing that would happen. It would be a very controversial thing that would happen, and they knew that it might bring bloodshed. But the main thing they wanted to do was, once Lincoln was elected, was leave us alone. We don't want to have part of you anymore because we don't feel we can get a fair shake with you anymore. So once Abraham Lincoln was elected, and also if you look at that election and see all the Republicans that were elected up north during that election, they knew the handwriting was on the wall. Lincoln tried to say, well, we're going to preserve slavery in the states that have it, you know, but the South just felt like the handwriting's on the wall. These are abolitionists. They're going to get rid of slavery. And the South had so much tied up into that, that the idea of that in early 1861. February they met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America.
Hello everybody, I'm Alex Adams. As Brian was talking about the South, I'm going to be discussing today about the North's reason for war. Now the North, they felt like, the South could not leave. It was violating, Constitution or whatever their opinions were. The South, like he was talking about, felt like they did have a right, which in my opinions they do have a right. They did have a right to leave. And he was talking about, their trade with Britain. The South's trade with Britain was important because Britain bought a lot of their cotton. And so industry was very well. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a blockade that the North had. It may have been later on in the war, or it may have been before, actually, Sumter. But I'm going to talk about some of the Northerners' opinions was that, we want to stick this Union together. And there's a lot of things today in today's world talking about the North wanting, just all about slavery. That's what's being taught today. Well, that's, not always the case. A lot of it is the Union forever. And if you listen to a lot of songs from that time period, it's the Union forever. Doesn't hardly mention slavery, but it's a lot of it was for, to keep the Union preserved. Actually, Lincoln stated, if it was I think it was his inauguration address in 1860 when he won with his Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, he said that this war will be for the preservation of the Union, not for slavery. And he said that, later on, we'll talk about, he said that later on when the slaves tried to, come to the North. But really, in everyone's opinions in the North was this is for, to keep the Confederacy in the Union. They thought that, that the South wasn't going to have their way because we want to keep this together. They were thinking about the past war, the Revolution, and all the things that they've done, which is really good. And, there are mixed emotions in there. And that's why you had some people in the South wanting to stay pro-Union, which in East Tennessee, which we are now, there was a lot of people pro-Union. And it was on that borderline, they were pro-Union and pro-Confederates. And, but a lot of people in the North did not think about the slavery part. Because the North, the whole country was still under slavery. There was no slave laws until 1863 when he puts in the slave laws. But up north it was, it wasn't about slavery, it was about preserving the Union, keeping the Union together. And later as the rebellion, got more, there was, well, let me tell you about this. In January of 1866, 1861, the Star of the West, the South Carolina, Fort Sumter was there, and the Star of the West was trying to take supplies to it. This is before, this is a year after the election, and the Star of the West was trying to bring supplies to General, I can't recall his name right now, but he needed supplies with, you can go ahead and say it out loud. Anderson. General Anderson needed supplies. And it was actually fired upon by the Citadel, and we will talk about that, later on about Sumter. And but that was January 19th, and then a couple months later, Lincoln will discuss to his cabinet what actions should be resupplying the fort. But basically, all it was with the Union was we want to preserve this Union, this country, the Union forever. And now you had some people up north that thought about slavery, and it was it was a divided opinion up north, but mostly it was for that. Also, the Irish that lived up north. The Irish didn't like black people. They did not like them because they felt like that they competed for the lowest jobs, just like the Irish did. They competed for low jobs, and so did the blacks. And so they, it was. And then later on, when after the 1863 laws where Lincoln banned slavery, they actually start rioting. We'll talk about that later. So that's it, and thank you.
Once the Confederates formed their own country, at first there were 6, actually 7 states, including Texas, that formed the original Confederacy. They wanted to move pretty quickly to obtain any kind of federal lands that were inside the Confederacy. That included arsenals, that included the mints, any type of federal property, they wanted to confiscate that. And as Alex was talking about, one of the last holdouts was Fort Sumter. And we'll talk about it just a little bit, about how that Lincoln tried to resupply Fort Sumter, and that was a failure. But please keep in mind that what the South wanted to do was to be left alone, that the Federals inside their lands needed to leave. We're going to confiscate federal land, it's ours now, and they needed to establish relations with other countries. And so they have representatives that are going to England, they're going to France. They make treaties with the American Indians in the West, the Cherokee, I think the Choctaw, and some others, to come on their side, and they did so. So they tried to move really quick to establish a country and to get that recognition from England and France. And one other thing that they did that was more likely meant to just be a temporary solution, but a very provocative one, is that they placed their capital in Richmond, Virginia.
Hello everybody, I'm going to be talking again about the Fort Sumter and everything that went on there now. Our last video was about the beginning of the war, the cause of the war, views from both sides of the war. And today, I'm going to be talking about Fort Sumter, actually. And I discussed when we were down there, I was saying about Fort Sumter, the Star of the West. The Star of the West, of course, was a U.S. naval ship, and Colonel Anderson instead of General Anderson, was in charge of Fort Sumter at that time. Was in Fort Sumter at that time. Called on Lincoln saying they need supplies, they're running out of rations, they're going to need some supplies. And so, at that time, it was in January, the Star of the West was on its way, about made its way to Fort Sumter out on the port of Charleston, South Carolina, and was fired upon by the Citadel. It knocked out its bow, I think it was called, and it just turned around, didn't want to take any more. It just turned around, and it was really a hurt for the U.S. And a couple months later, Lincoln called a cabinet meeting to discuss whether to try again to resupply Fort Sumter, and which they went ahead, but in April, later on in April, it was April 12th through the 14th, or April 13th, and they was fired upon from shores, and the U.S. was taking heavy fire. They were, of course, in Fort Sumter, but the Confederates, really, laid it on them, and finally forced the North had to surrender the fort to the South. So now the South has this fort, and the South has all its supplies in it, and it was a blowing defeat. But the one thing that it was, no one was killed, if I'm correct, in that battle. Which is, something that some people say it's, it was a battle, but without, no blood. So if it's a battle, but no one was killed in the battle. It was just a bunch of artillery. It's actually, you can go to the fort right now and see everything. But now, what really made the Southerns mad was after the Fort Sumter. Was Lincoln thought, we have to do something about this. This was a major attack on our country, and if the Confederate States wanted war, that they were going to get war. And so Lincoln called up 75,000 troops voluntarily from each state, from a lot of the states, to come and form an army to put down the rebellion. And actually they asked General Lee to take command of this army that was going to be placed to put down the rebellion. When they asked him, he said absolutely not. And that's when he resigned. And but yeah, that's what really, kicked off the Confederates, is when Lincoln did call up troops right after Fort Sumter. Voluntarily asked troops to come. So, we'll get more coming up, and